he did something that, according to what you just explained, brings benefit to the USAID programs.
The USAID staff do what the political appointees tell them to do.
Well,
Right?
okay.
They don't initiate these things.
They don't.
No.
So that means that all these directives came from the White House.
The White House, yes, and the State Department.
So that, okay, but then the White House, the State Department responds to the White House. So you are telling me that under the Biden administration, the USAID lost its course, yes or no?
I think AID needs to be more independent of the
And
political
you just told me,
wars
you just
in
told me
Washington.
that the State Department is the one that directs.
Yes.
That, okay, and the State Department responds to the White House.
That's correct.
All right, so that means then that the White House gave the wrong directives to USAID.
In my view.
In your view. Good.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, that's all we needed to know. So now we have a new sheriff in town called Donald Trump, and then that guy brought another guy called Elon Musk to do the job, something that no one else has done before. So why do we need to criticize him?
Because he doesn't know anything about development. He may be a genius at technology. He does not know anything about development.
But wait. Development has nothing to do with what is the mission statement for USAID? Secure, prosper, and value American values. Either $2 million for the native Indians in Guatemala to change their sex surgeries has nothing to do with that.
$15 billion was spent on humanitarian assistance in emergencies and refugee camps. There's particular skills you learn in doing that. I did that.
I understand,
I know
but
what
you're
is.
talking about what works. I'm talking about what does not work.
Okay.
Gentlelady's time
Thank
has
you.
expired.
I appreciate, Chairman. Thank you, sir, for your time.
I would also let you know, Ms. Salazar, that I've had numerous calls from ambassadors during the Biden administration who intend to provide us with the reprimands that they wrote against career employees who were undermining their work, doing these programs that they didn't want, but did them anyways, and the administration didn't care. And we look forward to bringing those things to light as well. We are going to recess. As votes have been called, as I mentioned, we are going to recess until 10:50, and we will look forward to returning. Committee stands in recess.
I just want for the world. Thank you.
Let's get these witnesses back in their chairs. Committee will come to order. Chair now recognizes Representative Kamlager-Dove for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the ranking member. You know, I have noticed a theme with Republican hearing titles that always seem to have one word of truth in them, but they are strung together by callous duplicity, or as the chair said, lies. Betrayal is the word of truth today, and it is an incredibly accurate description of what Musk, Trump, and silent Republicans are doing to the American people. By unilaterally dismantling our entire foreign assistance apparatus, you have endangered every American who relies on that system to keep them safe from global crises and that relies on them to feed their own family. Not only that, but you have betrayed some of the stakeholders that I thought my colleagues cared most about: our farmers, our veterans, faith-based groups, diaspora communities in all of our districts, and the Constitution. Not to mention the people who have tragically died because you have ripped away the life-saving assistance they need to survive, and for no good reason. I was struck by the opening remarks of the chair. The chair mentioned helping people to vote. And why do Republicans not support the right to vote? There was a reference to all of these small dollars going to people in need who just happen to be of the LGBTQ community. And why are the Republicans, who actually crashed Grindr, the gay dating app, during the RNC, so focused on the LGBTQ community? But let's circle back to what the real betrayal looks like. First, there's the fact that Elon Musk ripped up the Constitution and our system of checks and balances by illegally dismantling USAID with zero congressional input. Congress is not a peanut gallery. It has constitutional oversight authorities that have been categorically violated. But this weaponization of government has been met with deafening silence, betrayal. And now to the so-called woke programming. The farmers. USAID's humanitarian assistance is a major source of income for American farmers, $2.1 billion in 2020. Farmers supply 41% of the food aid that USAID uses to feed starving people around the world, meaning that farmers' livelihoods directly benefit from these programs. The foreign aid freeze rips away their incomes while condemning vulnerable people to famine, betrayal. And veterans. American service members fought for decades in Afghanistan. Many of them are only alive today because the heroic service of Afghan interpreters, like my brother-in-law who served. And these folks we have worked with tirelessly to evacuate to the United States. But Trump canceled the refugee admissions program and left them behind, abandoned by the very people who used them for political gain and then ripped the rug out from underneath them at the first chance they got. Betrayal. And then the Christians. USAID supports numerous faith-based groups in implementing humanitarian assistance in some of the world's worst hotspots because their faith teaches them that every human life has dignity, is sacred, and is worth saving. Cutting off aid has forced massive layoffs at these organizations and desecrated their life's work. I guess no one cares about religious freedom when it interferes with a billionaire's political agenda. Betrayal. And diaspora communities. USAID's support for Pakistani democracy organizations and flood relief efforts is now gone. Students in Burma benefiting from USAID scholarships have now been deprived of a better future. Venezuelans who relied on USAID-funded integration services to build a life outside of Maduro's oppressive regime are now left in the lurch, and the Republicans are deporting them back into terror. You can claim to support any of these communities. How you can do that is beyond me. It is hypocrisy and it is betrayal. And finally, the American people. Every American is less safe today because USAID is not out in the field stopping crises from reaching our shores. If there was a pandemic-like disease outbreak that risked spreading to our shores, we could not respond. If there was a natural disaster in Mexico or the Caribbean that would drive people to our border, we could not respond. The dismantling of those protections is an unequivocal betrayal of the American people. Oh, but what about that new $400 million contract the State Department is just signing with Tesla for Cybertrucks? because I guess people need Cybertrucks more than they need malaria pills. So now to my questions, if I have time. Mr. Yoho, in your testimony, you touched on the important work of American farmers and the work of American universities in USAID Feed the Future Innovation Labs. What capabilities do we lose domestically, and what domestic constituencies do we hurt by eliminating these programs?
Those are important programs that have worked, and by this pause that we have right now, I think the goal is, instead of putting blame everywhere, we focus on how we get these things back online to do the work they have done. If you look at like the RUTF program, the Ready-to-Use Therapeutic Food Program, that saved over 17 million children, and it sources products from 27 different states in America that provide, income for our farmers, and those are things that we need to get back online as soon as we can, and I think you'll see that. There is a reset. It had to happen. Shame on us when I was in Congress that we didn't do these things earlier. It's done, can't go back, we can only go forward.
Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. And in answer to the question, the reason LGBTQ is the focus is because that's what became the focus of USAID and State Department. It was not the exception, it was the rule. We're just reading off the lists of grants and pages and pages and pages more. I now recognize Representative Kim for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mast, for holding this hearing. I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. The U.S. foreign assistance has long been a very powerful soft power tool to advance our American leadership by building trust with our allies, promoting democracy, stabilizing terrorism-prone regions, and providing market access for American businesses. However, we have seen serious and credible cases of wasteful uses of American taxpayer funds abroad. For example, $2.5 million were sent through USAID to build the electric vehicle charging stations in Vietnam. How is this spending critical to U.S. national security or advancing our American interests? They are not. Unfortunately, these cases of unproductive spending abroad undermine the many targeted, valuable, and effective foreign assistance programs that are essential to our national security. Mr. Yoho, as you know very well, the strategic competition with China and its Belt and Road Initiative is a top priority for the East Asia and the Pacific subcommittee that you once chaired and I now currently chair. Xi Jinping is watching, and he's waiting for the chance to fill any U.S. vacuum. And already there have been many reports of Chinese Communist Party officials signaling their willingness to replace USAID in Nepal and demining activities in Cambodia. And these are just the instances that we know about. Even critics of USAID acknowledge the critical soft power value of targeted and efficient programming. So let me ask you, if USAID is fully merged into the State Department, what specific authorities will the State Department's Bureau of East Asia and the Pacific need to effectively implement USAID programs to directly counter CCP's influence in the region, such as training journalists to expose illegal CCP information tactics or strengthening critical infrastructures there?
I think the important thing they can do is get it back online as quick as they can and put people, authorize them to get back into the field, the implementers. The State Department can do that, but I don't know if they have the bandwidth or if they have the expertise and the capability. The people that were there on the ground with USAID, as Minister Natsios said, these are the people that have institutional knowledge and they know how to do that. They're not R's or D's, they're mission driven, and I think we can get some of those people back in there that are experts in their field to move America's agenda forward of, are we going to be safer? Are we going to be stronger? And are we going to be more prosperous? And if we do that, those countries will be too, and it counters China. And if we're not there, China will be there.
Sure. So I'm glad that Secretary Rubio issued waivers for life-saving humanitarian assistance programs. However, I'm also hearing many concerns regarding the lack of clarity on those scope of the waivers and challenges with getting paused programs restarted. It's hard to restart them if we completely turn the lights off, right? So what recommendations do you have for the administration to ensure an effective waiver process?
Again, moving forward, I think the quickest thing they can do and the most effective thing is identify the program that you want to do, and then put the people in there that know how to implement that. That could be at state. There's people at USAID, and I know there's this big black eye on USAID, but I think we need to look at what they did do good. You know, it's like a cake recipe. One drop of kerosene in a cake batter ruins the whole thing. So what happened and what's been exposed doesn't mean the whole thing was bad. And like I said, not all aid programs are good, not all of them are bad. Let's take the good ones and implement them as quickly as we can so we do not cede that ground to China, Russia, anybody that doesn't like us.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Primorac. What specific reforms can be implemented so that current adult audit and review processes ensure programming aligns with our U.S. national interests?
I think transparency is probably the most important. We have various websites where we're supposed to provide information to the American public as to what we're doing in all these different countries, whether it's grants.gov or foreignassistance.gov. It's not consolidated. And too often, actually probably most of the time, we don't have information as to who are the awardees, who are the sub-awardees. If those are made available, and not only to Congress, they should be made available to the American people. I think by having this kind of transparency, that a lot of these bad things happening, people will be a little bit more careful because, you know, lots of people are watching.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. My time's up.
Thank you, Representative Kim. Chair now recognizes Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. You know, we've heard a lot this morning of kind of cherry-picking programs out of context and then a very narrow view and some that just aren't true about the bad things and the weird stuff that USAID has been supporting. There are programs in the Department of Agriculture that I bet we could pull out that show a waste of money and some weird programs that I certainly don't support, but I'm not calling for the dissolution of the Department of Agriculture. It's kind of like Mr. Natsios said, if there's a problem or you don't like a certain kind of program, you can fix that. You can address it. You can discuss it and talk about how to make it better, but you don't destroy it. You don't just throw the baby out with the bath. So why would we do that with USAID when the programs that it does support are so much better, so much more extensive, so much more productive than some of these little things that you've been hearing ad nauseum from the other side of the aisle? One of the areas that I'm particularly interested in that you've heard less about is how USAID supports democracy around the world, whether it's backsliding in some countries or whether it's just trying to develop democratic institutions in others. People are on the front lines in very dangerous situations, often trying to push democratic principles. And we have another number of programs through USAID that helps with that development. Mr. Natsios, would you talk about what happens when we pull out and when it comes to development of countries that would be friendly towards us or would be more democratic? What happens to those people who are on the ground? We know that this is a great source of soft diplomacy, soft power. We've heard generals say every dollar you spend on something like this is a dollar you don't spend on bullets and soldiers having to go and fight a hot war. But if we're not there, what are the consequences for democratic development?
My view is that the AID missions in the field are our greatest strength. 2/3 of the staff of AID are not Americans. They're Kenyans or Nigerians, they're Cambodians, they're Moroccans, wherever you are. And many of them go on to be the heads of state, believe it or not. The first woman head of state in Costa Rica was an FSN with AID for 10 years. The first woman vice president in El Salvador was a FSN with AID. The first lady of Peru was a FSN. Her husband got a PhD from the University of Chicago in economics. He was the president of Peru and the first Inca president in the history of the country. All of them devoted to the United States, all of them right of center and honest people. I was in Macedonia just before 9/11, and two of the FSN said, I said, any of you ever run for office? Two of them of our had just got elected to Parliament. And they said, we ran on the platform that we work for USAID. So not having our missions in the field has unintended consequences, because we are a recruitment ground for leaders in the developing world who are pro-American. Wouldn't it be better to have someone who got their degree in the United States rather than Beijing to be the head of state somewhere? I think it is. We have a story from Nigeria just a couple of years ago during COVID, where the Minister of Health was presented with a Chinese vaccine, Russian vaccine, or our vaccine. And the Minister of Health said, I got my PhD in the United States, or MD, and an AIDS scholarship. We're going with the American vaccines. In fact, I don't want these other vaccines in the country. And they bought them. This is not just a contribution. So having the missions in the field, having scholarship, having relationships with these countries through the missions is very important to build trust. And in my view, shutting them all down is not in our national interest. I understand that Secretary Rubio has sent out a message saying none of the FSNs will be laid off, they'll be integrated into the embassy. But they have to have foreign service officers from AID or people who know development, know procurement, and understand all of the rules to manage them. They can't do a lot of this stuff on their own. So I want one last comment about democracy. I'm a little troubled because I'm looking at the patterns of what's been canceled. All the democracy programs and governance programs have been canceled.
Exactly.
And I'm a little, I hope that's not a deliberate decision. Maybe I'm misreading it.
I don't think so.
If that's the case, it's a disaster, because people around the world who want democracy and want freedom rely on us. They look to the United States. They certainly don't look to China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, the CRIN alliance, as we call them in the Pentagon. They are our enemies. They're not our friends. And we need to support those democratic forces around the world, in my view.
I agree. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Titus. Chair now recognizes Representative Davidson.
I thank the chairman, and look, I appreciate this hearing. It's certainly timely. When we talk about woke and weaponized government, it's easy to get desensitized to the long list of frivolous, frankly, pretty radical programs that are being exposed. You know, stuff like $1.5 million for DEI in Serbia, $47,000 for transgender operas in Colombia, $2 million. The former ambassador to Guatemala talked to me about this, $2 million for transgender surgeries in conservative country like Guatemala. It's a long list. I mean, USAID funded scholarships for people who became terrorists like Anwar al-Awlaki. We've sent, under the guise of USAID, we sent money to UNRWA, which returned funds directly to Hamas. In blatant violation of U.S. law, the Helms Amendment, PEPFAR has funded abortions and killed babies. What is happening in Africa is just the tip of the pro-abortion iceberg that the Biden administration weaponized aid agencies into. It also happens to be against the law that Congress has passed. So USAID funded independent media, so-called, in Hungary, but it was actually trying to run a color revolution playbook to overturn the government, very popular government of Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who's a NATO ally. So let's be clear, this cultural revolution playbook hasn't just been weaponized against allies in foreign countries. It's been brought home and weaponized against our own citizens right here. If you had unapproved opinions of COVID vaccines or origins of COVID, or maybe the Hunter Biden laptop story, there was almost certainly a puppet NGO working overtime on taxpayer dollars, which contradicts the word NGO in the first place, to shut down or deplatform speech in America. That's a clear violation of the First Amendment. So, look, our staff has heard every day from terrible stories about the abuse of our government in conflict with our own national interest in places like Uganda, where if they don't embrace aborting babies, they will be retaliated against and have aid taken away from them. I mean, coercive activities. So thank goodness President Trump has brought us back into the Geneva Consensus Declaration, protecting life, building pro-life, and other values that align with America First policies. They advance our interests, but they also help our allies advance their interests. And that's probably it's terrible to waste the money, but it's also terrible to not just waste it, but to actually work against the interests of the United States. So, look, I agree that there's probably some things, and we'll get to those things, that are good. But when you have a completely non-responsive agency actively working to undermine the guidance that Congress is giving them, they don't steer. So last July, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a colleague of ours, introduced an amendment to defund USAID. And the amendment was defeated 81 to 331. Now, I voted yes, but 331 colleagues were opposed to this, somewhat radical change. I bet the vote would be different today. But thanks, Secretary Rubio's going to take charge and say, yeah, we're going to do the good things. We're just going to turn it off, and we're going to clean house. And I think that's where they were. We knew there were abuses there, but, that's what we're up against, folks. So let's just, Mr. Primorac, you've written about disgraceful efforts in the Biden administration to bully conservative countries into accepting radical gender theory, abortion policies, a far-left agenda. In a piece last year, you wrote that East African faith leaders viewed USAID staff as, quote, missionaries of evil because the Biden administration hijacked popular aid programs to promote their agenda. Could you elaborate on that?
I traveled to Africa a couple of times last year and spoken to many of them who visit here in the United States. And many of them, like me, remember the 1990s, where I was involved in democracy development, and we helped turn the former Warsaw countries into allies of the United States. But these were values that were akin to our Bill of Rights. Things have really radically changed a lot. I've spoken to a lot of faith-based organizations that are feeding hungry. In Kenya, for instance, they have so many refugees from surrounding countries. Some of these dioceses, they simply will not take U.S. funding because it's tied to all. It had been tied to all of these things. I moderated a panel on Africa at Liberty University, and a governor from the northern part of Nigeria had a conversation with Samantha Power, who told her that you have to tie food aid with all of this other woke stuff.
Crazy leverage. And look, I wish I could talk more, and I will submit questions for the record because, Mr. Yoho, look, nevertheless, there are certain things post USAID's demise and the imminent funeral for this agency that we might want to keep intact. So how do we advance our interest? I look forward to collaborating with you all, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Chair now recognizes Representative Amo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's ironic that this hearing is called the USAID betrayal because Donald Trump betrayed USAID. He betrayed the agency's mission and its employees. He betrayed the American workers and the businesses supported by USAID contracts, and he betrayed the literal starving children who rely on food from USAID to stave off hunger. I'd like to highlight a few of the groups that Republicans are leaving out in the cold with this freeze. Let's start with the USAID employees. Americans around the world, they feel abandoned by our government, saying, quote, "We have lost contact with Washington. We are on our own." Some USAID employees, again Americans, have been forced to flee the country where they worked after protests over frozen aid turned violent. What does it say about us when we turn our backs on our own citizens, these global helpers who are just doing their job? But the betrayal extends to every American worker who relies on USAID, including American farmers, manufacturers, and universities. In my home state, the University of Rhode Island works with USAID to improve aquatic food systems and fight food insecurity. Right now, the university is unable to access nearly $300,000 they are owed. Let me repeat, universities are being stiffed for work they have already completed. And that was before the funding freeze. What kind of government refuses to pay its debts? Might be a government led by a multi-time bankrupt billionaires, I suppose. But of all the people affected, the worst impact of this betrayal fall on those who rely on USAID for food and medical care. People are already dying because of the aid freeze. As you heard earlier, yesterday we learned that a 70-year-old woman in Thailand died because the aid freeze cut off her oxygen supply and her access to care. Whether from lack of medical attention or from starvation, more people will die because of Trump's decision, and my colleagues on the other side having a collective silence. It's mind-boggling. This food aid was funded. Some of it was already purchased. It is ready to feed starving people. As this Inspector General report finds, right here, before they were fired, USAID stopped work orders jeopardized nearly $500 million in food assistance, leaving 500,000 metric tons of American-grown food at risk of spoiling. Look, if DOGE wants to eliminate waste, it can start with the life-saving food that is literally rotting in our ports because of Trump's betrayal. This administration has failed us. It has compromised our national security. We beat our chests about national security. This is hurting it. Adversaries like China and Russia are salivating at our retreat. They are reaching out to our allies and partners to undermine our work across the world. Republicans are abandoning global health work. That's an insane decision after a global health pandemic that we've recently experienced. Right now, there's a deadly Ebola outbreak in Uganda where more than a dozen Americans are exposed to this fatal virus. But where's the United States? Nowhere to be found. Look, I worked on President Obama's response to Ebola domestically and President Biden's response to COVID when I worked at the White House in 2 stints. And the number one lesson from the pandemic playbook is that we must contain the virus before it kills more people and makes its way to the United States. It is in our best interests to get involved. So I know I'm running short on time, but former Administrator Natsios, if you could answer quickly, do any of the betrayals that I have explained here today make America safer or promote America's values abroad?
I do believe that a robust foreign aid program, properly managed, is in our national interest. I wrote an article for Foreign Affairs that came out 2 weeks ago, February 7th, with a realist policy, not a liberal internationalist policy, on how we should run our aid program during this period of great power rivalry. The basic argument is that, humanitarian assistance and health should be based on need only. All the rest of it should be based on the following standards. One is there are 14 choke points in the high seas that control the food supply of the world. We should have aid missions in these countries. We do in Egypt. It's not just because Israel is security is connected to Egypt. It's because the Suez Canal is there. Morocco, they're not going to change the geography of the Gibraltar Straits. AID had a mission in Panama, and we left because it's a middle-income country. We should not have left, in my view. There should be a permanent mission in Panama because the Panama Canal is not going to go away. When we left, guess who moved in? The Chinese do. And who is upset with this now? Properly so, is the president. We should have had a large aid mission permanently in Panama. I went down there with my university, and they all wanted it. They didn't want us to leave. So I think we need to place our missions more strategically. The area around Russia and China are under severe stress. All of the Central Asian countries want a larger aid mission. You know, the Kazakhstan, we were going to move out, and the president said, we'll pay for half of it. I said, what? It's an aid program. He said, we don't want you to leave, Mr. Natsios. We want aid here. We want the United States here. And we value what you're doing, so we will pay from our gas revenues half of the cost of the aid program.
Thank the gentleman for his response. Gentleman's time.
Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter in the article from which I cited.
So ordered. Gentlemen may want to find a time to apologize on Twitter or somewhere else to the administration, or thank the administration, as $6+ million, as one example, has gone to the WFP, the World Food Program. $250,000 in one line item for Ebola response, another $1.5 million for Ebola response, another $250,000 for Ebola response. The list goes on and on. Those are programs that have moved forward, and it goes exactly to your point of being more strategic not doing the absurd, crazy BS that has been done in the past. It all comes to an end, and can't wait to have the people come here and literally stand before us and answer for the craziness they've been doing. Representative Baird is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank the witnesses for being here. And Dr. Yoho, it's always a good just when I can see you. So, but you know, I want to express that the American people really deserve not to have their tax dollars spent on the programs that Chairman Mast mentioned earlier in his opening statement. And I really appreciated Emeritus McCall reminding us about how the USAID came about. And it was really initially created, as was said, to combat the Soviet Union and their efforts to spread communism around the world. So it's disappointing to hear about the billions of dollars being distributed to foreign countries, and some of those are our adversaries, that without really accomplishing our mission. So we have people here at home that are really struggling. For example, those that are still sleeping in tents after some of the hurricanes, and it's cold winter time. And so I think you can recognize, and I'm sure you recognize, the importance of taking care of our own people. But anyway, Dr. Yoho, thank you for your service in the 113th Congress. And I'm interested in agriculture, just as I know you are. So I would really be interested to hear your perspective as a veterinarian on the impact of early detection of zoonotic diseases and the development of early detection and vaccines for controlling some of these diseases. And
sure. Thanks for that question, because it's very important. You know, there's so many things that are going around. The things that affect people in pandemics and epidemics and things like that originate in the animal world, the zoonotics. There's 27 viral families that come through, and we saw the effect of COVID. I mean, COVID is in the animal world, it's in the human world. The thing we're looking at now is H5N1, the highly pathogenic avian influenza. We're seeing it mutate and get into the mammals, from the birds to the dairy cattle to the feline population, into the porcine population, and into the human population. This is a very dangerous virus if it gains a hold in the human population and can get to the point of transmission the way influenza viruses did. COVID, as bad as it was, had about a 97% recovery rate. You get one of these bad strains of influenza or the Marburg virus that's showing up, or a new strain of Ebola, they have a 40 to 50% death rate. Those things, what we went through with COVID was bad enough, but it's nothing like what we're going to see. And the research that we do through organizations like our land-grant universities, those are the ones that are on the cutting edge of this. But then you have multi-funded donor international organizations like CEPI, the Coalition Epidemic Preparedness Innovators. They are doing research on the emerging viruses so that we can have the platform for the vaccines to be developed ahead of time. And this is that platform. The United States provides about 5% of their funding, roughly $170 million over the last 5 years, out of a budget that they have of about a little over $4 billion. The amazing thing is we've received about $1.25 billion back here in the United States of America that go into our research universities, our biotech parks, to do this advanced research, and that leads to global health and national health, and you can't have national security if you don't have health security.
so could you, are you supportive of the idea that having people in some of these foreign countries allows us to have early detection?
It really does, and I think as Administrator Natsios brought up, if we have missions in these, we can monitor the spread of that, and they're the first ones, if they're trained in the medical field and they can follow these things, we can see where it's breaking out. We can do the mitigation of quarantining that area before it gets to a pandemic. And it's, again, this is national security. We don't want to cloud the good that they do with some of these programs that we heard that were abused that should never have happened, because that ruins the whole credibility of us. It ruins the credibility of the aid arm of the United States of America, and it's that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. Do either one of the other witnesses have a comment? We got about 28 seconds left.
I agree with every single word of what Dr. Yoho just said. He's absolutely correct.
That's
and
good.
I didn't think of adding in the the animal diseases just from a veterinary point of view in terms of monitoring. That's a very good idea.
Stick around a while.
I would just add that these are important ideas, but we also have to strengthen the capability of other countries to be able to do it on their own. Countries in Africa and Latin America, it's like year after year we're spending a ton of money and we're not getting ownership from these countries. And that, to me, is a better, more mature relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. My time's up, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Baird. Chair now recognizes Representative Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the past 2 weeks, the Trump administration and unelected billionaire Elon Musk have led a reckless and illegal attack on USAID, freezing funds for an agency that, in the past words of the Republicans' own witness, Mr. Primorac, quote, increase country self-reliance and resilience, all while advancing American values and interests. Stopping USAID's work jeopardizes millions of lives and billions of dollars of investments in American small businesses and farms, all while undermining our national security, diplomatic efforts, and global influence. It's great to be on this committee. Before coming to Congress, I actually spent many years working for a Seattle-based global health nonprofit organization that employs about 1,600 people in my district as well as around the world, and many of our partners were USAID funded, and so I got to see firsthand the direct impact of effective USAID programs and life-saving work all over the world. The devastation that's being caused by this irresponsible funding freeze is alarming and painful, even though Secretary Rubio did backtrack from Trump's order and said that life-saving humanitarian work would be exempt from the freeze on foreign aid through a complicated waiver process. That process has been a mess. Funding has stayed frozen, even for programs with a waiver. And now there's a new directive that again puts any approvals for these waivers on hold. Drug deliveries have been stopped, life-saving food is rotting at ports, and we have abandoned people with experimental drugs and medical products in their bodies, cutting them off from the researchers who supervise their care. So let's be clear, this conspiracy theory-driven liquidation by DOGE is about trying to come up with spending cuts. That's the other committee I'm running back and forth between. However minor in the grand scheme of things, that they hope will finance the extension of Trump tax scam 2.0, the effort to make American taxpayers pay for tax cuts for the wealthiest. Dangerously, it's also about fueling an erroneous belief that America spends too much on foreign aid that does not serve American interests. If you ask any American or the average American in this country how much we spend, they'll say 25% of our federal budget is going to foreign aid. And I'll tell you what, give me a number that you would be willing to spend on foreign aid and we'll agree to spend it. And they'll say 10%. But guess what? We actually don't even spend 0.75% of our entire federal budget on foreign assistance. And so the reality is that USAID spends much less than most Americans think, and the impact for that tiny amount of money is extremely important for our diplomatic efforts, for our national security, and for our relationships and global presence on the stage. Mr. Natsios, you are the former Massachusetts Republican Party chair. You served as the U.S. administrator under George W. Bush. Can you briefly explain why the average American should care about USAID money and work, and what are the benefits to the average American? And I have a couple questions for you, so just be brief, please.
We can't shut ourselves off from the world because our borders, we have a huge problem with the border. I have no doubt that that's a legitimate issue. We need to deal with it. But I'll tell you what's going to happen once the border is impregnable. They're going to come through the coastline. And you can't put walls up for the whole coastline of the United States. It's too big. I live on the coast in the summertime. We even live in Texas, but in the summertime we live in Maine because it's a little hot in Texas. And I don't want walls up on the coastline in Maine. So how do you deal with that? You make sure that if famines are starting, you stop them before they get out of hand. You know what, people, at the end of any famine, people start moving en masse. When you have an earthquake, as we did in Haiti, what do people do? They start leaving the island. Where do they come? They come to the United States. Not through the border, along the coast. So we need a presence in the world to reduce forced migration. It's the biggest forced migration crisis in the history since World War II. 125 million people are now not where they intend to be. They're refugees or internally displaced. Number two, we already went through the diseases. It's not in American interest to have a disease get out of control because it's going to be a catastrophe for all of us. And Dr. Yoho is absolutely correct. This pandemic was nowhere near as bad as 1918. 5% of the world's population died in 1918 in 6 months.
I'm going to stop you because I have one more question before I get to the end of my time. The waivers. Secretary Rubio said these waivers are there. Are they working? Even in PEPFAR, are they working? Are we getting money to these life-saving programs?
I have spoken to the Christian NGOs because I know them. That's the community I come from. And they said they appreciate the waivers, they have the waivers, but they are not, there's no money flowing to them. That's what they told me.
A waiver doesn't
feed
families.
There's no reason why. Many of them are old friends of mine. They would not make this up.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I just want to congratulate RFK, who has just been confirmed by the Senate. Say congratulations, speaking of health, and say now Representative Self is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is an advantage to being this far down the dais. There's too much material to cover that's come out of this briefing. So to my colleagues on the other side, they like to talk about this firing of the IGs. They forget the 2022 law that specifically says 30 days paid, then you can be fired. And then the unelected people that are working in the executive branch, as far as I know, there are only 2 elected people throughout the entire elected branch, executive branch. That's the president and the vice president. Every other one of the 2 million plus the 12 million contractors are unelected. So everybody that we are praising, as well as the people that we are condemning, are all unelected. Mr. Natsios, it's either you or during one of your colleague on the other aisle during your testimony said, well, it's only a small number. And it reminded me of the reporter that said about the Argentinian gang taking over just a couple of apartment buildings. Well, it's only a couple of apartment buildings. This country is $36 trillion in debt. We are trying in this Congress to do something about that, but we have taken all of these small amounts now for decades, and they now add up to $36 trillion in debt. So every small amount is crucial. 40%, you said that 40% of the USAID are compliance officers. That's not the issue. What are they complying to? During the Biden administration, they were complying to things that were not in the interest of the United States. I don't care about the percentage. What are they requiring compliance of would be my question. So this is for Dr. Yoho and Max. So the title of this agency is Agency for International Development. Is it not? Is that correct? Mm-hmm. International Development. So just in the few grants that we've been looking at, there is a USAID for activities in D.C. to provide USAID employees in D.C. with counseling, organizational resilience, wellness, and work-life balance. Now, I realize that D.C. might be different than the rest of the United States, but it's not international. We'll skip over and having worked in both the third world, Africa and the Middle East, we'll skip over the climate change because a poor country doesn't care about climate change. They care about survival. But I want to go to a USAID contract, excuse me, for activities in Albuquerque. And this is for you, Mr. Yoho, Dr. Yoho, excuse me. Emergency DEI support in Albuquerque. Now, I assume that's Albuquerque, New Mexico. So it was in 2022 through 2023. So it may have been in your last budget. Were you aware of emergency DEI support? Probably not. It's an unfair question. In Albuquerque. So, and then the last one I want to talk about is another USAID for activities in D.C. Now, this one is really interesting because it is to hire an LGBT advisor for the USAID's U.S. Personal Services Contractor Program. But the interesting thing about this is it is to undisclosed contractor.
Wow.
That one requires some sort of investigation. So my question is to you, Mr. Natsios, why do we have activities in the United States if this is international development?
Well, I haven't read that, so I can't tell what's in, but I can tell you
Microphone.
Sorry. I can tell you I was in a commission. This is when I was teaching at Georgetown after I left AID. A number of officers came back from Afghanistan and Iraq whose colleagues had been murdered by Taliban. We lost a large number of contract staff in both countries, and they committed suicide. And so they created a commission, which they asked me to serve on, and I did, to see what we need to do when people come back. Because, and this is true for the military, my son was in Afghanistan. I was in the first Gulf War as a major in the Army Reserves that was mobilized. Actually, I was in the Bush administration. I left to go to Iraq. And there's a suicide problem in the U.S. military. So I believe, but I'm not sure, that may have been counseling, because they do it in an organized way. If they see depression when people come back from the field who've seen a lot of violence, then they put them through.
I'll actually give you that, because you're right. We still have 17 military veterans that commit suicide every day.
Right.
I'm on the VA committee as well. I was in Afghanistan and the Gulf for Iraq.
Let me mention the compliance officers, what they comply with. It's a very good question. The federal acquisition regulations, which were passed by the U.S. Congress, I might add, it's 2,000 pages long. I tried to read it when I was the aid administrator. I almost jumped out the 4-story window. They are so complicated. They're worse than the IRS code. We have to comply with them. When people say, well, why is the aid stuff so complicated?
Let me stop you there, because leadership matters. And in the Biden administration, leadership came from the top. We will not, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back, but that is the central point. It's not the regulations, it's leadership at the top, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Self. Chair now recognizes Mr. Olszewski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and your service. I'll just start with a point my colleague just made about the Inspector Generals. In fact, there are provisions to remove an Inspector General, but again, they were not fired in any of these cases. Inspector General firings, the President must provide Congress 30-day notice and, quote, substantive rationale, including detailed and case-specific reasons for the firing. And to my knowledge, that has not taken place. I really appreciate, again, you all being here. I'll just reinforce the point that was made by Ranking Member Meeks earlier, that I think that as helpful as these conversations are, it would be even more beneficial, especially as a new member, to have representatives of the administration also at the table so that we can hear directly from them about what they're doing, why they're doing it as we exercise our oversight work. You know, I just want to also say, as someone new here, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, I welcome the opportunity to go after some of these programs and some of this spending. I want to be at the table with all of you. I think that we can agree that several examples that were cited today merit investigation, defunding. If there was inappropriate action, there should be action taken. I completely agree with that, but I think there is a well-established process that does not include wholesale elimination or pausing of funding. I guess my concerns are twofold, one of which is that in the meantime, we are affecting real Americans. We talked about that earlier, real Americans who are either employees and have given their life to this country in service to it, or there are those who are farmers and other folks who are helping out. So as we think about this work, I'm particularly concerned about the funding freezes that are being taken place. Congress explicitly has the power of the purse under Article 1 of the United States Constitution. In the wake of overreach by the Nixon administration, Congress passed the Impoundment Act of 1974 that said the president may only propose rescissions or pulling back funding with specific notice to Congress and with approval of Congress within 45 days. Again, none of that has happened in any of these cases, and I would just encourage colleagues to say, again, I want to be part of these conversations, but let's do it through the legal and well-established process. For those of you who don't know my background, before I was a state rep and a county executive, I was a school teacher, and so really believe in the power of education, both domestically and internationally. And one of the things that worries me, particularly now as a new member on the Subcommittee of Africa, is we know there are tens of millions of individuals on that continent who cannot read. There are tens of millions of children now not in school. There were programs that were being afforded 44 million learners, young people, under USAID-supported programs were being taken place. So in addition to the democracy programs being defunded we talked about, my understanding is there's no waiver and there's no funding for education. I guess my question is, would education programs, and we can sort of do a yes or no, or if you keep your answer, like, do you see any concern for the education programs that were being supported by USAID?
Do I see any concerns with them, or I see the benefit that we had with the education, and when you go back to the 1961, they focused on agriculture and education, and as Mr. Natsios brought out, we used to educate leaders around the world that when we go around, as you go on delegations, they were educated here. There's over 300,000 students going to China. That used to not that many coming here in the past, but China has jumped on this and they see the value, and that effect from that will be 10 to 15 years down the road.
Let me ask you let me show you or mention one major benefit of education that has to do with conflict. They've done studies of all these militias that are so vicious and so destabilizing all over the world. Almost all of them, the young men, are completely illiterate. They've never been to any schooling at all. And that's how they recruit them. Yep. When I was in Darfur as a special envoy, I noticed that. They didn't even know, they didn't know what the United States was. These people were that isolated from the world. They didn't know what Europe was. And that's not good. It's destabilizing, and it affects us when these groups start attacking. Sometimes they attack Americans.
Yes. So. Just reclaiming a little bit of time. I completely agree with both of you. Thank you for that response. I think as we think about economic development, as we think about world security, people are less likely to endorse political violence, to join those when they are educated. And so, as we're taking that step, I would just welcome, particularly you, Administrator Natsios, how you would go about through a legal framework if you were working in the position currently, if you could follow up this committee, how you would go through and actually make those changes to programs that are of concern without jeopardizing all of those other actions.
Well, you can put some of it in statute, and I certainly would, but part of it is the two parties working together, which is, when I was in office, the two parties they supported aid, and they helped me a lot, I have to tell you. And when we needed support, I got more support sometimes from the Hill than I did from the other branch.
I'll say sign me up and amen to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Representative Olszewski. And I would just say that the authority for Secretary Rubio to consolidate, reduce, eliminate, it does fall, though you were not here, in a law passed in the 2024 appropriations, SFOPS appropriations, section 7063, where you can expand, eliminate, consolidate, downsize, cover department agencies, expand or reduce the size of permanent civil service, foreign service, the list goes on and on. And again, I would also remind everybody that all but 3 Democrats voted for that, that are on this committee that were here at the time. And I now recognize Representative Moylan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as many of my colleagues previously mentioned, the U.S. Agency on International Development is in dire need of reform. And the chairman has already done an excellent job highlighting some of the wasteful and burden that has burdened the American taxpayer, both in this hearing and on YouTube. Yet, when we talk about how USAID betrayed the American people, it's also important to recognize some of the good USAID has accomplished when done right. Being from Indo-Pacific, I know the critical role that U.S. foreign aid has played in disaster response. As an example, when done right, USAID has provided much-needed humanitarian assistance to Japan after the 2011 Fukushima disaster. Specifically, USAID deployed its disaster assistance response team to Japan for almost 2 months. With many similar examples elsewhere, USAID's track record in disaster assistance has proven to be a positive force when done right. As an alumni, I can also speak on the incredible partnership USAID provides to the University of Guam and other academic institutions by offering internships, fellowships, and grant opportunities. And when done right, USAID has made it possible for the U.S. to connect with other nations on a societal level. Now, as we look at America's diplomatic effectiveness, and when done right, I commend the opportunities that USAID has provided to students. These successes make USAID's wasteful programs all the more heartbreaking. For every stride the agency has made to prevent disease, they fund drag shows. For every country they have helped after disasters, they fund DEI seminars. My hope is that Secretary Rubio maintains what works, but hopefully it's clear that USAID needs to change. Dr. Yoho, your previous foreign affairs legislation highlighted the strong relationships between the U.S. and partner nations in Pacific and Asia. Where do you think USAID succeeded in this region, and where do you think it needs to improve?
I think where it's succeeded, there's multiple examples of that. You look at the work they've done with organizations like CEPI or in the food programs and the educational programs like you brought up. Those create goodwill that make us stronger. Programs like we've heard talked about today drives nations away from us, and if they drive them away, it makes us weaker. So we need to focus on those. I work a lot in the agricultural sector my whole life as a veterinarian, and working on food security and taking that knowledge and going into the island nations, or whether it's in Africa, wherever it is, teaching them our best practices that we've learned, and then teaming up with aid, USAID, to carry these out and then wean these countries off. It creates trading partners. It just makes us stronger in the end, and it creates that relationship that we have that's going to make us both more secure.
Thank you. For Mr. Primorac, your contribution to Project 2025 focuses on foreign assistance role to counter PRC efforts. Now, despite the fraud, waste, and abuse, the programs that work in USAID are incredibly diplomatic tool. How do you think we can maintain necessary USAID programs like disaster response, health, and economic growth while trimming this mismanagement?
Thank you. Actually, when I was leading the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, I had to deal with many disaster responses, and we did it quite well. We also had a very good and robust counter China framework there. Unfortunately, the next administration just tore it all down. I think when we're talking about how do we prevent losing the good by taking away the bad, that we have to regain the trust of the American people. And right now, the more they learn, the more they're distrustful. That's why I think this review, this pause and review, is very important so that the American people can feel that, no, all of this bad stuff is gone.
Thank you. Thank you. And for my final question, Mr. Natsios, if you can, could you please explain some of the challenges associated with the Pacific and Asia time during your tenure, please?
Well, China was not as big a threat when I was in office. In fact, Hu Jintao was very hopeful in getting the Sudanese government to be responsible because President Bush called him and asked him. And China was liberalizing then, and that's been reversed by Xi Jinping. I think Xi Jinping, I shouldn't say this, but it was a disaster for China. I think Hu Jintao, if they followed the route he was taking, China would not be what it's doing now, and I think it's really sad. The Asian countries feel very threatened. I was just in Bangkok, I think it was in October, and we talked to, my delegation talked to a prominent political scientist, and this is what he said. And there were Chinese in the room when he said it. He said, "We love America, we love freedom, but you're unreliable. You come in, you come out, you leave, we can't predict what you're doing."
Thank you very much.
And the Chinese are always here.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Moreland. Chair now recognizes Representative Jackson.
Thank you much, Chairman. I think it's important to hear the voices of employees directly impacted by this administration's effort to dismantle USAID. One Foreign Service member recently filed a declaration declaring how the chaos created by these abrupt actions of USAID being shut down jeopardized his and his family's safety during the recent evacuation from the DRC. I ask unanimous consent that his account be entered into the record book, Mr. Chairman. It's a harrowing account of we've left our employees abroad stranded because of the rashness of this decision. I have this entered into the record, Chairman. Mr. Primorac, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Yoho and Natsios, for coming out today. Mr. Primorac, you've written extensively in Project 2025 about your critique of USAID. May I ask you, do you work with any of the members of DOGE or DOGE? How do you pronounce the name of the committee?
No, not at all. No communication whatsoever.
Do you know the pronunciation of that organization?
I just call it DOGE like others do.
Okay. Is it a private firm or is it a government entity?
It's a government entity, and the people working for it are government approved.
It was formed by who?
The President of the United States.
And how is it funded?
I understand that most are working for free, but any other costs are going to be covered by the U.S. government.
If they're working for free, who's paying them? Are they employees of Mr. Musk?
I have no idea.
Okay, I just know that you have an extremely close working relationship with the organization. And how many years have you worked in foreign affairs and in foreign aid?
About 35 years, different capacities from NGOs as a contractor, State Department, working for the office of or for the Vice President, and also directly with USAID.
Thank you. Is there anything that a 19-year-old could tell you about USAID that you don't understand from your years of experience?
My understanding is that they're technical staff.
Can any of those 19-year-olds teach you something that you don't understand about USAID?
In terms of anything to do with data overview and looking at things, I'm just clueless. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think it, and for the record, I'd like it to be clear that you and I would probably have a difference of opinion on what diversity means. In this African American History Month, Mr. Frederick Douglass had written an article and a speech regarding composite nation, that this is a land of many different cultures, races, ethnicities that have all come to call this great land home. And if we're looking at the future of Africa in the year 2050, being 1 in 4 human beings on Earth, that there should be a push for cultural diversity, expanding how we reach out to people. And so when we talk about America and USAID betrayal, I'd like to put the eye on DOGE. Not one member on this panel has had anything to say or do with the cuts of food. And let it also be entered into the record at this moment, the irony of the richest man on earth taking food away from the poorest humans on this earth. Let it also be entered into the record that the most powerful man on earth is denying food assistance, medical assistance, malaria vaccinations to the poorest people on earth. We don't need to operate in this chaotic manner. I would like to ask Mr. Natsios, how should this project work? How should we be convened today that would make this more productive?
Sorry. This is a more radical proposal, but I had proposed this in Foreign Affairs some years ago. I think we need to consolidate the MCC, the DFC, AID, and a couple of the foreign aid parts of the State Department into one department and raise the visibility and integrate the programs more. I don't think, for example, there'd be a representative for the DFC and the MCC in each country that they work in. They can have the aid mission do that. They could be an integrated mission for all of these purposes. There are countries where there's CDC and AID running the same program, PEPFAR. It's never been corrected. Frankly, they fight with each other. It's embarrassing and it's duplicative, and there's no need for it. I think they should put one agency in charge of the whole thing, and that's it. That's what happened with the malaria program, and it's worked very well. The third thing I would do is decentralize. Now, with what's going on now, no one will agree to this, but the literature on bureaucratic processes, James Q. Wilson, my favorite writer, who's, by the way, a conservative, he says decentralize every administrative function at the lowest level where people have knowledge of what's going on. You have to have oversight in Washington. But AID during the Cold War was the most decentralized agency, and it drove the Russians crazy because the mission directors and the ambassadors could be responsive to the local president and the local prime minister, and that's one of the reasons we won the Cold War. We helped win the Cold War through AID because we were highly decentralized and very responsive. Right now, there are 275 earmarks in AID. We tell the country what, because we don't have any choice. The whole budget, there's no flexibility in the budget.
Thank you, gentlemen, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Jackson. I would wonder how many transgender operas they funded during the Cold War. Probably not many. Chair now recognizes Representative Biggs from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your efforts in organizing this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimonies today. So today's hearing has provided a target-rich environment of examples of funding allocations that, while perhaps they were intended for worthy causes, in my opinion, they raise serious questions about our priorities and where our focus truly lies. These include, and we've mentioned many, but just to name a couple others, $3.3 million for being LGBTQ in the Caribbean, and $37.6 million for sex workers, their clients, and transgender individuals in South Africa. While I acknowledge the complex global changes USAID seeks to address, we must ask a fundamental question. Are we truly fulfilling our responsibility to the American people when we allocate tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for programs abroad, while neglecting critical, and yes, I said critical needs right here at home, just like districts in South Carolina's 3rd District, which I represent? I struggle to explain to veterans in Newberry County who's fighting to find a job why our resources are directed overseas to programs that don't enhance our national security instead of supporting his career prospects. We've mentioned health care. I watched a veteran with his face in his hands sobbing because he couldn't get health care needs met. We've talked about the mental health needs that he couldn't get met. And he said to me, I feel like I'm a hamster in a wheel. I can't get out of the process. I find it difficult to justify to families in Greenwood that are facing mounting medical bills while resources are being spent on programs abroad, when those funds could expand access to vital health care services in their own community. I question how we can prioritize funding initiatives overseas, when we have cybersecurity vulnerabilities in Anderson County that threaten local businesses and critical infrastructure. For those of us who are guided by Christian values, the principle of charity begins at home. It resonates strongly with me. While we are called to care for all of God's children, there is also a natural and an understandable inclination to prioritize the needs of our immediate community, our fellow citizens, and those within our own nation. Let me be very clear. This is not about abandoning our global responsibilities. It's about investing in the very foundation of our nation, our communities, our families, and our future. It's about ensuring that the hardworking people of South Carolina's 3rd District and all across the nation are not left behind while resources are directed to woke programs that do not advance American interest. So my question to our witnesses is very simple. What went wrong, and why did the oversight measures fail to prevent taxpayer money from being spent on wasteful programs that don't put America first?
Accountability and transparency, and it's this body, and I was a part of this body, we didn't do our job, is what I feel. The American people sent us up here to do something. We hear the IG reports, this person that got fired, he got fired, he was the IG, made a report, gets fired. There's an IG report every year we don't act, and if we don't act, this is what happens. You know, we complain about everything that's bad, and then we don't act, and then when somebody like Trump comes in, and there'll be somebody after that, and when they come in and they do this, we get upset. You know, we've got to fix Congress. That's why people send us here.
I would also add that what I've seen over the past 25 years is the progressive left has gradually just seized control over the entire foreign aid industrial complex. And that's something, the political sociology of the industry has to be changed. If we're not, otherwise we're going to have this same vicious circle occur again and again.
Thank you.
Just let me add, there is a large number of Mormons at AID. I've never met a communist Mormon before. There aren't any that I know of. I don't theologically agree with them, but I have great respect for the Mormons. There's a very large number of practicing Catholics in AID and evangelicals. And there's a large number, as I said earlier today, of missionary kids who were, why? Because they speak the languages of the countries they were brought up in. And they make wonderful foreign service officers, and many of them have risen to the senior levels of the agency. Is there a contingent of younger, very liberal? Yes, there are. But it's very mixed. And my experience in the agency, maybe it's changed, is that when you ask officers to do something, they do it. I didn't used to have to ask their backgrounds. I just said, I want this done. And if they didn't do it, I would take action. I actually fired 16 senior people when I was in office.
Thank you, Mr.
3 of them were
Natsios.
political.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Even if they're Catholic, if they're doing LGBTQ musicals in Ireland, their time is coming to an end. The chair now recognizes Representative Connolly.
Thank you. And Ted, welcome back. It's good to see you. Mr. Natsios, when you were an administrator, did you oversee an agency that was rife with LGBTQ dances in Ireland and, I don't know, condoms to the tune of $2 million in Gaza and all kinds of iffy, marginal, flaky projects that were funded with U.S. taxpayer money, bringing dishonor to the United States of America? Would that be a fair characterization of AID from your point of view?
Well, it certainly wasn't when I was there. And I don't think it is now myself, but I do think there are programs that I saw on the list that I would not have allowed in my agency.
Well, let's stipulate that, but let's not let that characterize AID, because all of us are losers if that succeeds, it seems to me. Global health. What percentage of AID's work would fall under the rubric of global health? Fighting disease, child maternal health care, or rehydration projects, on and on. Polio, cystic
$8 billion.
What's that?
$8 billion.
$8 billion out of 40?
Out of $38 billion last
Out of
year.
38. So big chunk. What about food security and nutrition
the
programs?
emergency response part of aid is now by far the largest. It's $15 billion. It just amazes me because it's so much more that I had when I was in office.
So 23 of the 38 billion is just those two categories.
That is correct.
And those aren't fringe projects. Those are really life-saving projects.
Yes, they
is
are.
that fair characterization?
Yes.
And what about disaster relief?
Well, the $15 billion is the food security. Food security for me is the emergency side. Agriculture is separate from that, and that's what I think you're talking about in the longer-term development sense.
But when we're talking about disaster assistance, we're not only talking food.
No.
For example, my fire department is part of a FEMA AID relationship,
Right.
where they can go to trouble spots overseas and, again, try to save lives.
Right. I don't know what part of the $15 billion is food versus what we call non-food assistance, which is usually emergency medical care and public health, like immunizing kids in refugee camps and that kind of thing.
So
I don't know the breakdown.
So let's say one were sincere about wanting to clean up marginal, fringy projects that should never have been funded. Is the way to do that to basically announce we're going to fire 10,000 employees and leave 239 left?
It is not.
And what would be the consequences of depopulating the agency to the tune of 10,000 out of 10,239 employees?
My experience, I've run 7 institutions in the last 50 years now. The 8 officers that I work with were among the smartest and the best managers that I've worked with, and the most creative, because the circumstances they deal with in the developing world are very challenging. I think losing career people is like losing the cadre of the military officers. It's a disaster for the United States.
And the chairman seems to be under the impression that the appropriations bill provides blanket authority to Secretary of State Marco Rubio. I beg to differ. My view is that ultimately AID was established by statute in the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 as amended. And if you want to dismantle or fold it into another organization, you must get statutory authority from the United States Congress, and we certainly will fight that out. Final point, Mr. Natsios, and maybe Ted Yoho, you may want to comment as well. I'm worried about the vacuum being created by these actions, that China is going to waltz right in there. They're already big actors. Now we, the United States, are going to make them even more so, and I struggle to see how that's in an American interest. Why don't you comment?
It's going to drive people closer to China, Russia, the adversaries, and we see this. But I saw that before, too, with the programs. I had one of the past presidents of Ghana say that if we want aid, but if we have one party from the United States in power, they have a short list. If we have another one, it's a long list. He goes, if we go to China, they say, here's your money. But they said this, I would rather do business with the United States. That's something that we can take advantage, and we need to focus on those things, because that makes us stronger, safer, and more prosperous, not just here, but in those other countries. We need to get back to the basic mission here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Connolly. Gentleman from New Jersey, Representative Kane is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our witnesses for being here today. America is spending $40 billion in foreign aid, yet much of that money never reaches the intended recipients. Instead, it gets caught up in bureaucratic inefficiencies and organizations that have not always been transparent with the American taxpayer. A USAID report published in June of 2023 under the Biden administration noted that just 1 out of every $10 reaches the actual people in need abroad. A recent study by the Middle East Forum revealed that USAID awarded $164 million in taxpayer funds to extremist organizations, including $122 million to groups linked to designated terrorist entities. I believe that my colleagues here would agree that this reckless spending has drifted from American interests and instead has benefited foreign interests. It is time that we commit to cutting waste, fraud, and abuse in government funding on programs and initiatives that do not align with American values. American people deserve to know where and how the money is being spent and how they align with the U.S. interest. Mr. Yoho, should this reorganization include a comprehensive forensic audit of USAID spending over the past 4 years? How should this audit identify waste, fraud, corruption, and programs that may have undermined U.S. foreign policy objectives?
Absolutely, but I mean, you could go back years. But it's a great opportunity for bipartisan leadership conducing oversight and defining the priorities and the parameters of future USAID assistance programs. That leads to the certainty that where we're not wavering. It creates continuity in our programs, and it makes us stronger.
Yeah, as you were just, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And it must be done in a bipartisan effort. If not, it'll go away with it when tides change.
Well, as you had just said in your previous answer to another question, you're right. The best policies here and abroad are consistent over administrations.
Sure.
They are transparent with the American people as well as people looking from abroad. And so having that bipartisan strategy and consistency is extraordinarily important. What are ways that you think that we can ensure that they are consistent over time, these policies?
I ponder that. And if you look at, we'll just take the JCPOA and the Paris Climate Accord. President Obama put us in both. President Trump took us out of both. President Biden put us back in both. President Trump takes us out. Stand on the sidelines as another nation looking in at America. They're like, these people don't know what they're doing. We have no confidence that we're exuding. Congress, I think, can direct it as this is the policy of the United States of America, and give leeway to the executive branch in times of emergencies. But if we don't have a policy of the United States versus a Democratic Party or a Republican policy, and that's the spoils of winning an election, but they should also focus on what's best for America instead of what's best for a party. And until we do that, we're going to go back and forth on this, and it's up to us and, of course, the American people.
And so how would you, if you were structuring this legislatively and making sure it's bipartisan solutions that's consistent over time, how would you structure that under your best vision?
I think it's just getting consensus and building a bipartisan movement in this, and you've got a great opportunity. You've got this Congress has an opportunity you haven't had in over 40 years with the Supreme Court ruling on the Chevron deference case. The Chevron deference, when that came into effect, allowed the administrative agencies to have all this power. All right, that's been repealed. Congress can go ahead and move forward and say, this is what an agency may do. This is what they shall not do. And if we don't do that in a bipartisan way, it's going to go right back to these agencies, and Congress has allowed their powers to be usurped again by administrative agency, and you have administrative law.
And as we're doing that and constructing it, how do we ensure that taxpayer-funded aid does not fall into the hands of corrupt governments, terrorist organizations, or entities that are hostile to U.S. interests, Mr. Yoho?
Define the mission of what you want, and then you have to have that oversight, as Mr. Natsios brought up. You got to approve these things, and you have to have it done now. And I think there should be an immediate review after this stuff. You know, with when you send out a check, you want to get it back. The IRS makes us do that and be accountable for our taxes, and I think we should do the same thing in government programs.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. I yield back my time.
Could I just add one thing in terms of a suggestion?
Gentleman's time has expired, so maybe in another round. Thank you. Thank the gentleman from New Jersey. Representative McBride is now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Mass. It's a privilege to serve on this committee with you and Ranking Member Meeks. It's also an honor to be here for my first Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. I am looking forward to working alongside each and every one of you in a bipartisan manner in support of U.S. interests. Unfortunately, right now, we are seeing a partisan attack on USAID, one of the most effective tools of American leadership and our national security. By gutting this agency, President Trump is not just turning his back on our global commitments. He's undermining American interests and our security. And he is causing unnecessary deaths. If President Trump can get away with gutting USAID, he can do it anywhere. That means that no part of the federal government, including programs like Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid, will be safe from this administration. The president and the majority conference in this House are fostering opposition to vital government programs by mischaracterizing diversity efforts and using it as a Trojan horse to gut programs that all Americans rely on. This hearing is titled USAID Betrayal, but let's be clear, the real betrayal is that Donald Trump promised to lower costs facing families, but instead is pursuing policies that threaten American jobs and increase costs. Foreign aid is not a charity. It's an investment in stability, security, global health, economic security, American leadership, and American jobs. USAID buys food from farmers in Delaware to help prevent famine and conflict abroad. USAID funds over $1 million of critical research at the University of Delaware on both energy and poultry production. USAID collaborates with Delaware's businesses to expand agriculture in places like Ukraine. These cuts, this effort to decimate USAID, doesn't just hurt people in distant countries, it hurts Delawareans. And so my first question for you, Mr. Natsios, I want to talk about everyone's favorite topic. It may have come up already, egg prices. One reason for rising costs is the spread of bird flu. Yet this administration has stopped monitoring bird flu in 49 countries, increasing the risk of it spreading to the U.S. and decimating our poultry industry, a cornerstone of Delaware's economy. With USAID halting its efforts on bird flu, I'm curious what you believe could be the impact on egg prices and also, of course, the health of Americans.
Well, I have said before that I think the 80 USAID missions that used to exist are our frontline defense for infectious disease generally, and I'm now convinced by Dr. Yoho that we should add in animal disease, zoonotic diseases, not that have jumped to humans, although that's a huge problem, but just that are in the animal kingdom because it affects our domesticated population of animals in the United States, whose food supply is critical to our health in the United States. So, and I might add to the developing world as well. We have had some very successful programs over the years to eliminate these zoonotic diseases in Africa and Central America, Mexico, and I think we should revive those. I know when Bush was president that they monitored all birds dying in Alaska because there's billions of birds, and we used to test them for virus. No, I didn't, but I think USDA tested them for viruses to see if bird flu was in the flocks, and then try to take action. So I think early warning systems in all areas are extremely important so we can do preparedness work to protect the American people. But we also, at the same time, be protecting people in the developing world, too.
That's right. One quick question, because we've heard commentary about, quote, fringe programs at USAID. You acknowledge that there are programs at USAID now that you might not have approved in the past. I think we've already seen that there have been most gross mischaracterizations of programs, that there have been outright mistruths said about USAID programs right now, and that many of the sort of most outrageous things that we're hearing turn out not to be accurate. And you led, and I'm running out of time, but you led USAID when PEPFAR was created under President Bush. I'm curious if you believe that there are elements of PEPFAR which have saved 25 million lives globally, that there are elements of PEPFAR that could be mischaracterized and sound a bit outrageous.
I suppose there are. I actually wanted to include more local input into how they structured and how we structured the program in each country, because it's very standardized. And I'm not into central standardization in aid programs. I'm a decentralist. I guess I'm a federalist, you'd say, and I believe all development is local and that we should allow the countries more discretion as to how we structure the PEPFAR program. But I lost that battle 25 years ago, 23 years ago. If it were reauthorized, I'd add a lot more local discretion in terms of structuring the program.
Representative's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Representative Radwagen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Talofa lava. I want to thank the three of you for testifying today. Congressman Yoho, it's good to see you. I want to thank you for all the good things that you've done in the region. You've been a true friend of the Pacific. In the past 2 weeks, independent Samoa and the Cook Islands have signed deals with the PRC. With Kiribati to the north, independent Samoa to the west, the Cook Islands to our east, my home district of American Samoa is now surrounded on 3 sides by China-friendly nations. I have a couple of questions. During the Trump administration and the Biden administration, the State Department and USAID proposed that USAID take over and manage U.S. economic assistance and federal programs and services to the 3 strategically vital Compact of Free Association allies, namely Palau, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. We have made sure that was rejected because Congress has been providing all such assistance to those strategic partner island people through Interior Department since 1961, including under COFA since 1986. Now that assistance is appropriated so that Interior continues to actually administer these funds and programs under COFA for the next 20 years at least, and that will continue until Congress changes it. Does state and those who have or will be exercising USAID authorities understand that COFA economic assistance is not discretionary grants, but usually agreed to obligations that secure the highest level of strategic interests of the U.S. in the Pacific? Mr. Natsios? Any one of you are free to answer. Turn your mic on, please.
Could you just repeat it? I couldn't quite hear your question.
I'm running out of time now. I don't know whether the chairman will let me roll that back a bit. During the Trump administration and the Biden administration, the State Department and USAID proposed that USAID take over and manage U.S. economic assistance and federal programs and services to the three strategically vital Compact of Free Association allies, namely Palau, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. We made sure that was rejected because Congress has been providing all such assistance to those strategic partner island people through Interior Department since 1961, including under COFA since 1986. Now that assistance is appropriated so that Interior continues to actually administer these funds and programs under COFA for the next 20 years at least, and that'll continue until Congress changes it. Does state and those who have or will be exercising USAID authorities understand that COFA economic assistance is not discretionary grants, but usually agreed obligations that secure the highest level of strategic interests of U.S. in the Pacific?
Congresswoman, I don't know a lot about how the program works now, so I don't want to render a judgment. I would have some outside group that all of you agreed to evaluate the Interior program and then ask AID how it might change it, and then you decide. But I wouldn't dismiss AID, but if you are really devoted to the Interior option, then you keep it.
Thank you. My time is so brief, and you had me repeat a long question.
I'm sorry.
Congressman Yoho?
Yeah, same question.
Yes.
The compact has worked pretty well, and I think you guys vote on it and you determine your destiny of what you want to do. I would use USAID or whatever entity comes back as a facilitator, but I would certainly engage DFC, MCC to do those structural projects that you need that really boost your economy down there.
Do you think with the reforms for traditional USAID foreign assistance now underway that the role of agencies like the U.S. government's Development Finance Corporation that was mentioned earlier will become more important as instruments of U.S. foreign relations, or do DFC and similar agencies that harness private sector investment also need to be reformed? DFC was modeled after the Marshall Plan, which creates jobs in the private sector overseas instead of handing out grants. That can create markets for U.S. exports.
Sure.
So while we're promoting foreign investment in the U.S., should we also be promoting U.S. investment overseas to create jobs back here at home? What direction are we headed in this regard?
It's imperative that we do that. We need to revamp the reauthorization of the DFC. And if you look at post-World War II, if we did not come in there with a Marshall Plan or something like that, would Germany, Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, and the other countries that benefited from that, would they be in our top 20 trading partners? And if we didn't do that, who would have been in there to do that? It's either going to be our influence with our values, or it's going to be the other people, and we don't want they're authoritarian, and it'll be a disaster for the world. Liberty and freedom will go away.
Mr. Primorac, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Communist China cannot compete with our private sector. It's massive. When you include our allies in Japan and elsewhere, it's overwhelming. China cannot come close. So DFC as that tool to be able to bring in that kind of capital power, I think is a perfect solution. Thank you.
Mr. Natsios? Oh, Congressman? Do you have anything to add, Mr. Natsios?
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady's time has expired.
Gentlelady's
time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, can we get a bathroom break?
Can you
Two
hold
of
it?
us are 70 plus.
Can you hold it for two individuals or no?
I'm going to remind you that when you're 70.
I ask in seriousness, can you hold it for 2 individuals or no? If you can't, I'm happy to give you a restroom break. I want you to be able to concentrate on answering to our representatives. I don't want anybody to say you were distracted. So, all right, we will continue. We will muster on once more into the breach, dear friend. Chair now recognizes Representative Luna.
Chairman, for the record, I'd like to submit this letter saying that PEPFAR funding was actually resumed. I know there's been a lot of push saying that the Trump admin had actually cut it, but
so ordered.
Thank you. You know, I want to start out by saying initially I think the idea behind USAID was done with a good intention. However, we've come to find out that the agency has indeed, to a certain extent, operated in a rogue capacity. And USAID has absolutely broken the trust with the American people and not been transparent about where our taxpayer dollars are going. There's an individual by the name of Mike Benz. He actually served over at the State Department for a while, and he's been going on to expose a lot of what USAID has been doing, which, being a member of Oversight and being on this committee, I wanted to verify and see if he was telling the truth, which, much to my disappointment, he was. And I say that because I'm disappointed that our taxpayer dollars are funding some of these items. I mean, to just put this in perspective, in 2021, the Special Operations Command under Mark Milley, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, put out an instruction manual, a vision for 2021 and beyond, that contained instructions and examples on how the military could work with the State Department, Intel Services, and USAID using race riots. Here's examples of some of the instruction manuals here, 1 and 2, in order to destabilize nations. In addition to that, they advocated for setting up job fairs near some of these riots so that disaffected workers could gain employment. Now, as a member of Congress, I ask myself, did anyone in USAID get elected to Congress? How about to a presidency? When you are acting in the shadows and you are destabilizing nations using race wars to do it and then advocating that the military does it, in my opinion, not only do you put the future generations that would have to fight in those wars in jeopardy, but at the end of the day, you're operating without any oversight. So I guess the question for you guys is, Mr. Natsios, is that something that you were aware of? Are you aware that that instruction manual is being promoted not just with the military under Milley, but that USAID may be operating in this capacity? Because in my opinion, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of many of my constituents, I don't think that's where our taxpayer dollars need to be going.
Well, I completely agree with you. Personally, I doubt very much that what you've been told is accurate. But let me just tell you.
I'm telling you right now, I brought the receipts, okay? And the reason, I'm not trying to argue with you, but I find this disturbing on so many capacities. And I would like to also just, if I can, sir, Mike Benz, what he's exposing and bringing receipts, I've confirmed it. Thank you for doing that on behalf of the American people, because I understand that when you take on the intelligence agencies, we're also now finding that apparently in this manual, that they're also advocating for social media campaigns, illuminating controversy to a global audience. I mean, using disinformation campaigns. Is this happening here in our own country? Where's the oversight?
Just to ask you, who in the agency, what bureau?
I just said you can actually find that instruction in this manual that Milley approved.
Military manual, isn't it?
Yes, but Milley approved it. You have it right here. USAID working with government agencies. I mean, this is not.
Wait a second. Did AID say that, or did the military say AID?
Well, that would be the question for you, sir.
Well, I mean,
these operations. Sorry to interrupt you. These operations that are taking place without government oversight, without the authority of the president, without the authority of Congress. Real men and women serve and they die because of stuff like this. When you destabilize nations without any oversight, we have to fight those wars. You have our chairman right here that literally risked his life. No, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm frustrated. I know it's not necessarily your fault.
But I'm telling you,
but
it's
as a head of agency, that's not.
I'm telling what Ben's told you is nonsense.
That's not nonsense. These are the information and forms. And Ben's put this out to the American people.
AID did not write that,
sir, I disagree with you on so many levels, and I appreciate you being here today.
How do you know they
this
wrote
is not easy. How do I know what?
Any person can write AID's name into a manual. It goes on all
Sir,
the time.
they are advocating that the U.S. military
Not
work
the-
with
not
taxpayer-funded
AID.
State Department USAID funds to destabilize nations. That is
Someone
unacceptable.
special-
I don't care who wrote it. USAID needs to come down and condemn it. They need to provide oversight to Congress on exactly where tax dollars are going. And I know I might be at 17 seconds with our time, but sir, I hope that you agree. Can I, yes or no, do you agree that this is wrong, period?
I
Should
think
this
the
be
military
happening?
should be held accountable. I think it's
And
nonsense.
should USAID condemn it?
Nonsense to
Should
suggest that
USAID
AID
condemn
wrote
it?
that.
Should they condemn it?
The military should.
Should USAID also condemn this?
Of course, we don't
Thank you.
comment. AID
Chairman,
does
I yield
not
my time.
comment on military
Thank
mandates.
you, sir.
Ladies,
It's
time's
none of our
expired.
business.
Since there have been a couple more members that have shown up, and I promise you only two, let's do the 5-minute restroom break. You stand in recess for 5 minutes.